Okay, so let's see what Jesus had to say about this perfect righteousness. It seems like he's a pretty nice guy. He always had a way of making us feel good if you've spent any time reading the Bible. So we're going to take some of our words from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8. Here's what Jesus did in one of his sermons, one of his first sermons, a famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God." Well, now probably you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second. Is my heart pure? I mean, who has a perfectly pure heart? And we read a little further. He goes on, he says in verse 20, "But I warn you, unless you obey God better than the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees do, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven at all." Well, wait a second. I mean, the religious teachers and the Pharisees back in Jesus' day were like really super religious people, really good people. And Jesus is saying that you have to be better than them. You have to be more righteous than them. And then in case we miss the point, in verse 48, he says this, "But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Ouch. Like, who can be perfect? I can't be perfect. And here's really the truth of what Jesus is teaching about the kind of righteousness that's good enough for God. If you want to be good enough for God, here's something you need to know. God requires nothing less than perfect righteousness. Man, at first glance, that's pretty bad news. I mean, nobody has that, right? But really, this is the currency of heaven. The only thing that matters in heaven, the only thing that buys anything or that purchases anything in heaven, the only thing that will get us to heaven is perfect righteousness. This is what it meant in Matthew 5:8 when it says, "Only the righteous, the pure in heart will see God." Now, Jesus said this because it's the truth, and sometimes the truth hurts. Well, what does the Bible say about our righteousness? Maybe we're missing something here. Maybe the Bible says we're all pretty good and we're all pretty righteous. Maybe we need to just define it properly. Well, Isaiah 64 in the Old Testament says this. It says, "We are all infected and impure with sin." And here's what it says about our righteous deeds. It says, "When we proudly display our righteous deeds, we find that they are but filthy rags." Oh, great. So this isn't saying that your good deeds are filthy rags. It's saying your righteous deeds done by yourself, done in your own effort and in your own pride. It says it's filthy rags. In other words, it's saying it's really worthless before God. In fact, the Apostle Paul learned this. If you know anything about Paul in the New Testament, this was a Pharisee, a religious leader, and he was a really zealous guy. But he realized once he met Jesus, he realized that he brought nothing to the table, that he was bankrupt. He reached into his pockets and they were empty. And in the New Testament, Paul says it like this, Romans 3:20, he says, "For no one can ever be made right in God's sight by doing what the law commands. For the more we know God's law, the clearer it becomes that we aren't obeying it." And so what we realize here is that no one is righteous, nobody at all, that we're all sinners. This is the sad truth of the Bible. And this is our problem, is the sin problem. No one is perfectly righteous, which means no one on their own can see God. And really the only other thing we can add to this is the good news that only Jesus is righteous. So at least we know that the Bible teaches that Jesus is fully, perfectly righteous, but we're not. Now we'll get back to the good news here in the last video, video 3. But for now, why don't you hit pause, talk about some of these questions in red.